Okay, this is lecture number 2 on the U.S. Southwest, and it will be focused on the Mogollon and Ancestral Pueblo cultures. So, just as a reminder, the U.S. Southwest is traditionally defined as the area from Las Vegas, Nevada to Las Vegas, New Mexico, and from Durango, Colorado, all the way down to Durango in Mexico. However, within this area, there's a bunch of different cultural traditions. In the previous lecture, we focused on the Hohokam, and today we're going to be focusing on the Mogollon culture, which dates from 200 to 1450 CE, as well as the Ancestral Pueblo, which dates from 500 CE to 1540 CE. Just as a reminder, these are beginning dates, which signify when these cultural traits that are used to define each tradition are consistently recognized. So there were people in this area before the Mogollon and Ancestral Puebloans, and there were still people there around after. So for today, we're going to talk about the Mogollon first. They're concentrated in primarily southwest New Mexico, but also into eastern Arizona and down into northern California and West Texas. Northern Mexico and West Texas. And we're also going to be talking about the Ancestral Puebloans, who focus primarily in the Four Corners area. From the beginning, I want to recognize that there are a few cultural similarities shared among Mogollon and Puebloan sites and between the two cultures. First is that they all practice a mixed subsistence strategy of hunting and gathering and agriculture. These are farming communities that are dependent on rainfall, but irrigation was implemented where it was possible. These are pit house villages primarily that evolve into large masonry and adobe pueblos. What's called the pit house to pueblo transition occurs in each of these areas within about 100 years. Both these cultures construct and use subterranean rooms that are called kivas for ceremonial and communal practices. There are widespread pottery styles shared across this area, space and time. Talking about corrugated wares and white and red wares. And finally, we see a lot of patterns of migration amongst these societies, and that's usually due to what we interpret to be social as well as environmental conditions and changes in what happens with those processes. So you'll remember from last time that subsistence in the U.S. Southwest, they took advantage of several wild plant resources as well as wild game. However, in the northern Southwest, what we're going to be talking about more today, there was also domesticated turkeys, which is a pretty neat finding that we have. Chipstone is pretty similar across the area. There obviously is some variation based on the cultural traditions. However, I'm not a lithicist, so I do not specialize in this. But you get a sense here of different projectile point styles through time. There's also things called scrapers that would have been used to process hides, or maybe even in ceramic production. Drills would have been used for jewelry production. You think of like the little ornaments on necklaces. Knives, just a cutting implement. And then these things called denticulates, which have this serrated edge and would have been used for all sorts of different cutting. You could imagine processing a carcass, cutting plant material, all sorts of activities. Groundstone is pretty similar across the region too. Things like abraders. This is also potentially used to straighten arrow shafts. Mortar and pestles used for processing pigments, also plant materials, seeds, things like that. Mauls and axes. This is for primarily cutting axes, and then mauls are more for the bashing or mashing of materials. Chamalas here, these are actually things that would have gone on the end of a stick. They're kind of digging tools that would have helped with agriculture and also any kind of construction projects. And one of the last things are manos and metates. So these are objects that have been used to process primarily corn, but also could have been used for pinon nuts or mesquite beans, things like that would have been ground into more of a flour so they could be used and turned into tortillas or other sorts of products. This trough metate comes in a bit later. You can see how deep it is, and actually transitions into what are called mealing bins. So these are actually permanent features within rooms in pueblos eventually, where corn processing would have taken place. So these are places that are dedicated to a specific activity, usually close to plaza spaces where big ceremonies would have taken place and they needed food constantly being made. But yeah, the permanent nature of these is what makes them pretty significant. Okay, so focusing in on the Mogollon culture here in this map. This culture is named after the Mogollon Mountains in New Mexico. It was defined originally by Emil Haury in the 1930s based on his excavations at the Harris site and Mogollon Village in New Mexico. This culture occupied eastern Arizona, western New Mexico, and adjacent areas of northern Mexico and West Texas from 200 to 1450 CE. This area is relatively rugged, high altitude and desert areas, up in the mountains and plateau areas. Sites in this culture tend to be concentrated along rivers. For example, there are extensive irrigation features along the Mimbres River from dating to the 900s through 1100s. And there are several branches of the Mogollon culture that have been identified. The most important of which, or the one we know the most about, is the Mimbres branch, which is centered on the Mimbres River Valley, and we'll talk about them in a few minutes. All right, a little bit of culture history or chronology. For the Mogollon culture, it starts with the early Pithouse period. At this time, there are clusters of small rooms occupying in the upland areas. These include deep circular, oval, or amorphous pit houses with ramps or vestibule features. And brownware pottery is produced and sometimes is covered with a red slip. Moving to the late Pithouse period, these are now Pithouse villages. They've increased in size and have moved down to the flat terrace areas above the floodplains. They consist of primarily square pit houses that are clustered around a kiva structure. And pottery diversity has increased. We have red on brown pottery, white on red, as well as black on white pottery. At this time, there's also evidence of interaction with the Hohokam, but ending this pit house phase is actually the burning of several large communal pit houses across the entire region. The final phase is the Mogollon Pueblo phase. This is when we see large villages right on the valley floors near the arable land. They consist of above-ground stone or adobe pueblos. Pottery types are primarily black on white and polychrome. And the final sites of this period, so dating mostly to the 12 through 1400s, are concentrated in the upper Gila of New Mexico, as well as the Mogollon Rim area in eastern Arizona. Following 1450, the Mogollon peoples most likely migrated to join ancestral Puebloan or Hohokam communities. This is actually supported by oral traditions and archaeology. And this area was later occupied by the Apache people. So, what are the Mogollon best known for? Well, first off is their brown paste and coil and scrape pottery. They tend to construct deeply excavated semi-subterranean pit houses. They do occupy some cliff dwellings. They also have large masonry and adobe pueblos. The pit house to pueblo transition in this region takes place around 1000 CE. And it's also really well known for the classic Mimbres period in particular, which dates from 1000 to 1130 CE. And this is well known because of the intricate black on white pottery. Down below here you're seeing some of the motifs from pottery, Mimbres classic pottery. And it's also known for a lack of ceramic diversity that's followed by this influx of a diverse amount of regional styles. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. In terms of Pithouse architecture, I mentioned, these are circular, oval, moving into square-shaped pit houses. And here you get a sense of what that would have looked like in plan view up from above, as well as a profile through what they think these structures might have actually looked like when they were occupied. And this is a typology that Haury actually developed when he conducted his excavations at the Harris site. Okay, Mogollon pottery. This tradition begins around 250 CE with brownware pottery, and the style actually begins around there and persists for about 1,000 years, which is pretty impressive. It's primarily utilitarian ware, which means, it's used for daily activities. and not incredibly fancy compared to some of the other styles we might see later on. So these are simple forms that were replicated in later styles across the Southwest. Here you can see several different types belonging to what we call the Mogollon Brownware. They also have variable dates. So as I said, some of the earliest types come in around 200, 250 CE, but then they're still being made all the way up until almost 1500. So this is a very long sequence of brownware pottery production. Here you're starting to see some of the corrugated wares. So it's actually the coils are preserved on the exterior and then treated right at the end, either by fingernail impressions or using certain tools to push them together and actually seal the vessel. And it leaves this sort of design on the outside, which is pretty neat. And sometimes it's painted over, as you can see here with this McDonald corrugated ware. For Mogollon Redware, again, several different types. Its tradition begins around 200 CE and continues up into 1400. With increasing amounts of decoration and stylization. There are also whitewares. This is specifically from the northern Jornada, and it's the type called chupadero, black on white, that becomes pretty important in the P3, P4 periods of the Ancestral Puebloan area as well. Okay, so moving into some of the significant sites of this area. The Harris site in New Mexico, as I said, was originally excavated by Emil Howery in the 1930s. It's located in the north central portion of the Mimbres Valley. It was a large Pithouse period village. There were 34 houses that were either partially or wholly excavated, and they suggested a variety of sizes and shapes. But the total estimate was that there was about 100 houses at this site. Up here you can see the map of the Harris site that was originally created by Howery based on his excavations. So you see the different pit house locations and their different shapes and sizes. This actually here in this clearing is where the site was located in this historic photo. Okay, another significant site is the Gila Cliff Dwellings. At this site, the indigenous people made use of natural caves to build a set of interlinked dwellings. There's about 46 rooms in total, within 5 cliff alcoves above the canyon floor. So this site would have housed about 10 to 15 families. The Mogollon occupation here actually lasted about 20 years. It was 1275 to sometime into the early 1300s. There's another site nearby that's called the Heart Bar site, or TJ Ruins, and it's a 200-room pueblo up on top of the bluff that overlooks the Gila River, actually. This map here shows you the aerial view, again, of what the 5 alcoves look like and how the structures fit within them. Sorry. Then you get a sense, too, of what this pueblo looks like today. Here's TJ Ruin, as I mentioned, is up on top of the mesa and was about 200 rooms. You can also see some pit structure, kiva structures as well. These are the circles. Okay, so as I mentioned, the branch of the Mogollon we know the most about is the Mimbres Mogollon. The name Mimbres actually is a Spanish word for little willow, and it was given this name because it concentrates along the Mimbres River, where there was a lot of willow trees. So this culture occupied southwestern New Mexico from approximately 800 to 1250 CE. They had early domestic architecture and pottery styles that bear very strong resemblance to the Mogollon culture, but it's in the late part of this sequence that things become a bit different, and that's what distinguishes the Mimbres from other Mogollon's branches. It's best known for elaborate black on white pottery with human figures, realistic animals, and geometric designs. And it's really the classic, when we think of Mimbres, we think of the classic Mimbres period. This ends around 1130 CE. At that time, there's no more black on white pottery being produced. Large villages in the Mimbres Valley become abandoned, and we start to see smaller communities forming in the eastern Mimbres area over near this Truth or Consequences on the map here. And then finally, the Postclassic period consists of what tend to be larger pueblos yet again along the Rio Grande drainages over to the east. Okay, Mimbres Chronology. As I said, it starts with the Classic period. At this time, there are several large pueblos, so 100 to 200 room pueblos. We have this diagnostic black on white pottery, and it's everywhere. It's the predominant type at every site in this area, so it's a very inward social focus. That's how we've interpreted that very strong social identification associated with that and associated with being Mimbres, and they were not concerned with interacting with other people in nearby cultures. At this time, there are irrigation ditches that are built and maintained. Also, terraces are created to help catch the runoff from rain. And at the end of this period is when we see large villages become depopulated. Moving into the early Post-Classic, there are actually two subphases within this because it depends on which part of the region you're looking at. So for the Mimbres Valley, it's referred to as the Terminal Classic phase because things are coming to a close there. And in the Eastern Mimbres area, it's referred to as the Reorganization phase because we're actually seeing social transformation of sorts. People are reoccupying previous field houses and turning them into habitations. The last period is the Post-Classic, and at this time we're seeing hamlets in the Eastern Mimbres area grow into relatively large pueblos that tend to be built with more of these river cobbles. You can kind of see it in the photo in the background here. And at this time there's a significant increase in decorated ceramic types entering into the Mimbres region. So things like Salado and El Paso Polychrome, as well as Cibola Whiteware from further north. Okay, these are the brownwares that come from the Mimbres branch. They're, in terms of their styling, they're red on brown and a red on white, but it's still a brown paste. It's still pretty similar to what we're seeing in other parts of the Mogollon area. So it's really these very elaborate, intensively designed black on white types that distinguish the Mimbres from anywhere else in the Mogollon area, as well as anywhere else in the Southwest. These are highly valued ceramic vessels. You find them on the black market. I mentioned very early in the class that the sites were highly looted for trying to find and sell these pottery types. There are three primary styles that you can see, and they have specific dates associated with them. Like I said in the last lecture on the Hohokam, I'm not expecting you to know dates associated with each of these types, but I want you to remember Mimbres is very famous for these black on white ceramic bowls, especially those that you can see in the bottom row here that have very detailed, sometimes very accurate representations of animals, sometimes very abstract versions of animals or anthropomorphic figures. So, okay, one of the more important Mimbres sites is Swartz Ruin. It was excavated from 1924 to 1927 by the Cosgroves. You can see Hattie Cosgrove here on the right. She actually, I think she hand drew 700 different Mimbres pots for their publication on the excavations from this site. So it's the only Mimbres village that's been completely excavated. So it actually gives us a really good sense of how the site grew over time. We knew it grew in several phases, dating from 1000 to 1130 CE. At first, you can see on the left-hand side, there are 6 small room clusters. Those rooms were then added onto to enhance the size of the structure. And then finally, the room blocks that were beginning to form became even larger in the far right side. You can see 2 large clusters of room blocks that then had another additional set of rooms added to bring it to its final configuration. Gila's Ruin is another one of the large Mimbres Valley sites. Here we can see along the outsides, you can see some of the pit house structures that would have been the earlier constructions in this area, and then we have the above ground pueblo being constructed on top of those features later on. Okay, as I mentioned, when it comes to the Mimbres region, after 1130, which is the early Post-Classic period, we need to start thinking about things in terms of 2 different areas. So the First being the wide floodplain of the Mimbres Valley, which becomes depopulated at this time. Then we see people transitioning over to these upland areas on the outskirts of the Mimbres Valley. It's referred to as the Eastern Mimbres area. So for the Terminal Classic phase, this refers only to the occupation of the Mimbres Valley. It dates from 1130 into the late 1100s. And at this time, there's really only 3 sites that are still remaining and still populated. That includes Galaz, Nan Ranch, and Old Town down to the south. For the reorganization phase, this applies only to the Eastern Mimbres area. It begins at 1130 and it runs through the early 1200s. And so what it signifies is this reorganization. We're seeing what were previously these classic period large pueblos in the Mimbres Valley are abandoned. People are moving to very small little previous field houses, areas where maybe the resources hadn't been depleted as much, and they can kind of start over. The beautiful black and white pottery is no longer produced. Instead, we're seeing non-local imports come in, different types of black on white, but also polychromes from further south and east. So as I said, they're taking their previous field house areas and transforming these into larger hamlets where a family or two could be residing together. The full sequence, when we look at it, so the classic period lasted about 130 years, was primarily focused in the Mimbres Valley. The reorganization phase took about 50 years. So we're seeing pretty dispersed hamlets across the landscape, primarily in the Eastern Mimbres area. But this post-classic period is kind of a resurgence of the Mimbres. It lasts for at least 250 years. We don't know the actual end dates on it yet. But this is when we're seeing what was previously a very closed-off, isolated regional phenomenon is now open. There's lots of different ceramic types that are coming in. We're seeing them engaging in more exchange with other southwestern cultures. So things are finally opening up. This is a very significant sort of social change that we're observing. When we look at the distribution of ceramic types between these two phases, what you can see on the left is, as I mentioned, this shaded area. Everywhere, the predominant type, I'm talking 80-90% of a site assemblage is black on white. Remember, it's black on white pottery. But when we move into the reorganization and post-classic phase, we're seeing several different types. So the diversity of ceramics at sites has gone up significantly in the post-classic phase. Suddenly they're engaging and interacting with a lot of other cultures in the Southwest. A few of the large villages that end up being populated in the Eastern Mimbres area are Las Animas village. It states the Black Mountain phase, which is a very specific chronology for the Eastern Mimbres area. So it was occupied from about 1230 to into the 1300s. And then there's also Roadmap Village, which is a site I worked at and taught at field school. You've seen some of the images and photos that I took during our excavations there already. Sites at this time were located above these small washes or arroyos that would have fed down into the Rio Grande system. So you can see they're kind of overlooking, they're up on the mesa tops overlooking what would have been the river. The image on the right here is showing you, based on the direction, the color, and the size of these arrows, it's referring to different types of pottery and where they were coming from. So it's looking at how these sites were connected with other areas in the landscape over time. So why did the reorganization occur? Well, social pressures are one thing. Sites were becoming very highly aggregated and population was increasing. Also, the social phenomenon behind such a tightly controlled stylistic tradition of the Mimbres pottery could have contributed to very high social pressure to conform, and perhaps people just decided they didn't want to do that anymore. There is also evidence of drought and decreasing food supplies in the area at this time, and that would have also had been related to human impacts on the environment. So we're talking about soil depletion or the access to the decretion of wild plant resources. So the questions remain, did environmental changes affect humans, and did the reorganization help? I think the fact that the Mimbres were able to rebound into the post-classic period shows that this reorganization phase did help them to stay in a relatively similar area. They were able to survive and continue on. It's just that their material culture changed. Okay, so now we're going to transition to the Ancestral Pueblo. There are key differences in the architecture, ceramics, social organization, and religion that define 7 primary branches of Puebloan culture, which you can see listed here. However, the largest and densest settlements occur in Chaco Canyon, as well as on Mesa Verde. So those are the 2 areas we're going to focus our attention on today. So the Ancestral Puebloans, they're also known as Anasazi, which means old ones or enemies of my ancestors. These are Pueblo-dwelling peoples. They're maize agriculturists, and they reside in the northern southwest. They occupied the Four Corners region and the Colorado Pueblo from 500 to 1350 CE. And here we see the Pithouse to Pueblo transition occurring a little bit earlier than we did in the Mogollon area. It's coming into play around 900 CE instead. Okay, the chronology of the Puebloan culture. What we start to see is early Pueblo begins actually in the Basket Maker 3 phase, or period, excuse me. These people are practicing full-time agriculture. They live in pit house farmsteads, but they have little to no pottery. There are some neck-banded types at this time, and also simple white and red wares, but they're primarily using basketry, which is where the basket maker name comes from. They also had great kivas at this time that were used by multiple farmsteads. The P1 or Pueblo 1 period, consists of unit pueblos. So this is where we're seeing the pit house to Pueblo transition to come into play. People were still residing in pit houses at this time, but sometimes they were converting them to use them as kiva structures, and then maybe using storage spaces in these above ground Pueblo units. But at some point they started to occupy either both areas, both units, in the pueblos in the summer, maybe pit houses in the winter based on the environmental conditions, climatic conditions. But settlements are still pretty small at this time. They are able to store food for long term, which is good, helps with drought conditions and getting by in tough times. And also they're beginning to elaborate their white and red wares. In the Pueblo 2 or P2 phase, a lot of the architecture is the same as in P1, but we're starting to see multi-story masonry construction. This period signifies the height of Chaco. We're going to talk about Chaco in detail in a bit. It also is the time when it's comparable to the Mimbres Classic period, so that's important to keep in mind too. At this time, we're seeing an increase in long-distance trade and the introduction of corrugated pottery. The Pueblo 3 period sees the abandonment of Chaco, so the population starts to boom back in places like Mesa Verde, and that's where we see large pueblos built at the heads of canyons as well as in very large cliff-dwelling structures. The Pueblo 4 period, this is when, at this time, the Four Corners region has been completely abandoned, and we're starting to see aggregation into only a very few large villages around, and their site layout tends to be around large enclosed plazas. Finally, in the protohistoric period, we see even greater aggregation, and this is actually the time we start to see the formation of modern pueblos that are still around today. And of course, this period ends with Spanish contact. So the Puebloans are best known for constructing large multi-room and multi-story masonry complexes. They have distinctive architectural styles. There are tons of decorated pottery types. These are primarily white, red, and corrugated wares. There's long-distance exchange within the Southwest and down the line, or potentially direct exchange with Mexico. For example, we see macaws coming in, which would have been from deep inside of Mexico. They have a heavy dependence on cultivated crops, which means their religious beliefs were centered on rain and the growing of corn or maize. So, dry farming on the Colorado Plateau. This area is a higher elevation than the Hohokam region, so this provided them with more seasonality, which is a good thing. Gives them more access to different sorts of resources. But they're primarily dry and floodwater farmers. However, there were some cases where we're seeing irrigation used. Amongst these Puebloan cultures, though, we see variation among what are referred to as Western and Eastern Pueblos that are still observed today. So in the Western Pueblos, which are more Arizona, the Arizona Pueblos, Hopi, Zuni as well, actually, they developed an annual cycle of religious ritual based around rainmaking. Whereas the Eastern Pueblos, which nowadays tend to be concentrated right along the Rio Grande River, they practiced small-scale irrigation, so they didn't place as much emphasis on rainmaking ceremonies as they did in more of the western parts. So these are the sorts of cultural differentiation we can see based on environmental conditions. Among Puebloan archaeology, archaeoastronomy is pretty significant. There's a lot of different alignments. So this is the study or the belief that there are astronomical alignments used in the layout of different sites and also to plan farming and religious ceremonies. So a few examples of this are that the east-west axis of Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon, which are two of the great houses, they are aligned with some of the equinox alignments. For example, the dividing wall of Pueblo Bonito is aligned to true north. That's another significant alignment. The Sun Temple at Mesa Verde, they believe, was possibly used as an astronomical observatory. You can see here on the right, the upper image is what they call the Sun Dagger, located on Fajada Butte, which is very close to or in Chaco Canyon. I can't recall exactly where. And what it does is during certain times of the year, the sunlight passes through this three-slab formation here and actually places a beam of light onto this swirl that you can see on the back wall. So these are different ways that they could have been keeping track of the season, when it's time to plant, when it's time to harvest, things like that. The bottom image you can see is a pictograph that's also at Chaco, and it's believed to depict the occurrence of a supernova in the year 1054 CE. So what we're seeing is supernova and the alignment of the moon at this time. I don't really know much about it, so I can't say whether or not I believe it, but it's quite possible. Rock art is another significant artistic expression among Puebloan cultures. They're found in dispersed locations, but some areas have very high concentrations. There are common motifs that are used. You can see the wavy or spiral lines, footprints. We see animals, shields. This image here on the upper left image actually has what looks like a Bear Clan shield. So these are some types of warriors. The upper right image is a mythological scene, perhaps signifying, the birth of humans from some sort of, looks like a corn maiden with her little, I don't know what you call it, the hair design that she has going on. So a significant cultural practice among Puebloan cultures is what we call the Kachina Religion. This is based around spiritual beings in Puebloan cosmology. So these are actually considered to be personifications of things in the world. So there's a corn Kachina, and there's an owl Kachina, and there's a wolf Kachina, but there's also elements or specific locations or concepts that can be personified into these beings. And these beings are even known to possess and use familiar relations, so they are mothers and daughters and brothers and grandmothers amongst them. There are three general concepts that the Kachina religion is expressed through. The first is being the supernatural beings themselves, as they occur in the cosmos. There are also male dancers who perform during religious ceremonies that take place within plazas. You can see an image of them on the bottom right here. And then there are Kachina dolls, and these were originally made to help train and educate children, but nowadays there's quite a big artistic market for them, and tourist market. So people living in the modern pueblos today produce these and sell them for profit as well. So the Kachinas are believed to reside in the San Francisco Peaks, which are located near Flagstaff. It's believed that these creatures or these beings visit the Hopi villages during the first half of the year. So when they see, tends to be clouds that symbolize their presence. So you can see clouds concentrating around the peaks during the monsoon season, and then perhaps those clouds actually make their way over to the fields, or the water that pours down there makes its way in the river to the fields of the Hopi. But they're not exactly worshipped, the Kachinas, but they are highly venerated, and if they're given enough respect, they believe that they can garner them good favor or fortune. And these Kachina rituals are still practiced in modern Pueblos today, especially at Hopi, Zuni, and Tewa communities. I've been to a few dances up at Hopi, and it's a sight to see. It's a very impressive event. It's very impactful, and you can see and understand the meaning even though you don't understand what's being said or exactly what's going on. The image here on the left is from a wall mural, actually, depicting, I don't know the exact date of it, but this is a Kachina on the left. The other images are, artistic reconstructions. The upper one is some kind of eagle dance, I believe, that would have been happening inside a plaza, from what I can tell. But these activities would have also taken place within kiva structures underground. So the bottom right image is some sort of dance or performance ritual taking place within a kiva structure. Perhaps they would have emerged into or out of the kiva, and that would have been a significant element of the ceremony being performed. Okay, getting back to material culture. The architecture of Puebloan societies, beginning in the basket maker phase, is shallow pit houses. So we can see some examples here of what it would have looked like in profile, as well as what these structures would have just looked like from standing next to them on the landscape. Moving into the P1 period, we see this pit house to Pueblo transition. So you can tell the pit house is a little bit more shallow here. It has some of the characteristic features still. There's the ventilation shaft, which would have brought cool air down into the structure and would have allowed the hot air to escape through the hole in the roof. And then moving into P2, this is when we see room blocks. These are like a small little room block like this is what we refer to as a unit pueblo. It's maybe one, maybe two families, maybe an extended family. And then they would have had their own personal kiva right there in front of the room block. Again, similar sorts of structures and features within the kivas, the ventilation shaft. You can see the large bench that would have gone all the way around, but also, there's pottery, there's a mano metate down there for processing corn. So these are not always just ritual structures, but could have been used for other sorts of activities as well. Okay, site growth. So beginning in the basket maker phase, or period, so basket maker 3 period, it's pretty basic, small farmsteads of pit houses. When we get to P1, we start seeing small unit pueblos, but also you can see that they're constructing a kiva structure in front. They're also full-time corn producers, and you also see some of the domesticated turkeys hanging out here. In P2, they start building multi-level structures. You can see some of the ladders they would have had to use to move into or on top of the structures. They're not always accessible from the ground floor. Sometimes you have to enter in through the roof still on the top floor. In P3, the structures get even bigger. Sometimes we're seeing 4 to 5 story tall masonry construction, but also around the Mesa Verde area, you're seeing these canyon head sort of pueblos like the one you're seeing depicted here. In terms of settlement patterns, so what these settlements would have looked like on the landscape, very dispersed, small farmsteads, as I said, but they had a great kiva where they would have come together for more communal events certain times of the year. P1, this is when we see unit pueblos, but there may have actually been a smaller or a larger village that could have brought people together. P2, similar sort of pattern as P1, but things are getting a little bigger. There's unit pueblos still in the smaller villages, but the big village tends to be getting even larger. And again, Yes, even larger. So mostly just things are getting bigger, but we're not seeing a lot of aggregation on the landscape. Still, people are pretty dispersed across. When we look at the site maps, you can start to see a big change when it comes from P3 to P4. So these are two sites in the Cibola area, which is now occupied by the Zuni people. You can see that the structures are pretty dispersed and spread out. And you can tell quite a big difference when we compare that to what sites looked like in the Pueblo IV period. So now we're suddenly seeing very closed off. The plaza structures are completely enclosed by the pueblos themselves. So the black spaces here are pueblo rooms. So you're looking for the white space in the middle to be the actual plaza itself. And this is a significantly different imprint that it leaves, a footprint that it leaves on the landscape. And it's inside these plaza structures where all of the Kachina ritual, Kachina religion would have started to develop and been practiced. And it's a much more privatized sort of behavior. There are jewelry making and tools associated with that in Puebloan societies. This is a pretty significant process or practice. The upper one, you can see bones that have been transformed into awls. So it's kind of like a drill, yeah. Needles for the use of textiles, and then scrapers on the right side for perhaps lithic production as well as some sort of ceramic production as well. Those sorts of tools could have been used to produce the stone, ceramic, and turquoise pendants that you see in the middle. And then finally, we do see some of the shell bracelets coming in from the Hohokam culture. So there are definitely connections and exchanges happening across the Southwest. Due to the dry conditions and the caves that were sometimes occupied amongst Puebloan societies, we have some pretty unique finds. There's an actual basket that's been found in the Mesa Verde area on the upper left, and a pair of sandals that are still preserved. But also trade items. So the macaw feathers, the copper bells, that stuff's coming up from West Mexico. Shell bracelets coming in from the Hohokam. And the turquoise, the beads were actually produced at some of the large centers in the Puebloan culture, but the turquoise itself would have had to come from somewhere else. There is a ceramic proliferation among Puebloan societies. This is in terms of not only the styles, the way they're decorated, but also the vessel forms that we see. So seeing different types of jars, storage jars that differ from cooking jars, and that's usually based on the circumference of the opening at the top. So the image in the back here is probably more likely a storage jar. Various bowl shapes and sizes. Mugs are something that are really common. It looks a lot like a coffee mug that we have nowadays. That's pretty popular and very distinctive of the Mesa Verde area. Ladles, just like we use now, soup ladles, things like that. Small little seed pots and pitchers. So let's take a look at some of these styles. The neck-banded gray ware, this is an early type. You can see based on the dates. It's similar to the corrugated wares, but is not technically considered one. White wares can be quite diverse in the motifs that are used over time, and they become more elaborate over time. You can also see how they use the negative space to help to create and emphasize some of the designs that are being used, especially in the Chaco type here, the Tula Rosa as well. In terms of red wares, there's also several different types from across the region, dating as early as 700 CE all the way to 1400. Some of these actually turn into more polychromes, so the 4 Mile polychrome and Springerville polychrome are, what polychrome means is they're using more than one color of paint. So the vessel itself would have been covered in a red slip, and then the black and white paint that you see would have been applied on top of that to create the designs. Yep, just like in the Mogollon area, we also have corrugated wares here. As I said, you can kind of tell how they're pressed down to create this pattern amongst the coils as they get pressed into themselves. Jeddito yellow ware is very common. It's actually highly associated with ancestral Hopi communities, because the Hopi are very well known for still producing yellow ware pottery today. As you can see too in the bottom right, the Yaqui polychrome is produced all the way up until 1625. So these have some pretty long ranges over which they are produced. Glaze Wares, this comes in late in the P3, P4 times, mostly P4, and it signifies the use of more mineral-based paints instead of carbon-based paints. And there's been a lot of work done to help source where the minerals are coming from that are being used, and I don't have time to get into all the details of that, but nowadays when we think of glaze wares, we think primarily more of the eastern pueblos, so closer to the Rio Grande. That's where they tend to concentrate and be produced. I like this bottom right example here. You can see how it's not a very good high quality, I guess you could say, glaze. It's pretty runny and not very clear. It's not as clear as you can see in the one just to the left of that, but these are still being produced into the protohistoric and way beyond, Spanish contact. Okay, so I told you we were going to talk about two specific areas within the Puebloan world, the first being Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. This is a center of remarkable flowering of the ancestral Pueblo culture from 900 to 1100 CE. There are several large, well-planned Pueblo towns that we've referred to as great houses, actually. They are multi-story pueblos that contain kivas, great kivas, storage rooms, and ritual deposits. And they contain many luxury items, so we see lots of turquoise, seashells, copper bells, and actual macaw skeletons, in addition to their feathers are recovered from these sites. There are 15 great houses in total along a 9-mile stretch of the canyon floor in Chaco Canyon. There's also evidence of an extensive road and water control system within the canyon. What's important to realize, though, is that the arable land in Chaco Canyon itself could have only supported about 2,000 people. So the permanent population was likely very small. And these great houses may have actually just been huge storage houses where food would have been brought and stored for consumption during major ceremonies when the population spiked to tens of thousands for major ceremonies. Following a drought that occurred from about 1130 to 1180 CE, the Chaco regional system begins to decline. We see population decreases, and these people were likely shifting to other regions, so Mesa Verde being one of those back further north into the Four Corners area. Here we have a map that shows you some of the major great houses within Chaco Canyon itself. I'm going to talk to you about Pueblo Bonito here in what's called downtown Chaco, as well as Pueblo Alto, which is located up on top of the mesa itself. I've included a link here at the bottom to the Chaco Archive. They actually have a great website. So much of the data and pictures, images are available from all the excavations at the major sites within Chaco Canyon. I highly recommend checking it out. These are the site layouts of the major great houses within the canyon. Pueblo Bonito on the top right there is the largest of them all, but you can see that some of the others are right behind it. These buildings are constructed using what's called Core-and-Veneer Architecture. So the outer wall was where they would have paid very close attention to the patterning in the stones. The major stones would have been supported by what are called chinking stones. Those are the smaller, thinner little pieces. So they created specific sorts of designs that tend to have chronological significance, but the middle is just full of rubble. So they build these nice veneers on the outside, but the core of the wall itself is just stacked rubble to support the veneer on the outside. This is a nice slide. It gives you an idea of what some of the features in the pueblos are called, what they look like, how they were constructed. How do you actually build a multi-story pueblo? That's a pretty impressive architectural feat. You can obviously go and tour Chaco Canyon today. It's a national park. This gives you a sense then of what the ruins still look like today. This, from what you can see here, you're seeing at least 3 stories. So you can see the alignment of wooden beams across the wall in the middle and the back there. Then there would have been another set, it looks like, further up above that doorway / window. You can also see they have some reconstructions that you can walk through and take a look at. This is what the roofs would have looked like. And so based on the large wooden beams going one direction with the medium-sized branches, I guess, going the opposite, and then even smaller materials above that, which would have been clay, topped with clay to create a living surface. These T-shaped doorways are very common amongst Puebloan societies in general, but specifically at Chaco Canyon. And here you can see a few examples of the different masonry styles or architectural styles. So there's, like I said, chronological significance. I don't know enough myself to provide any information on that, but you can definitely seek it out if you are so interested. So, Chacoan Imports. There was actually a broad system of importation for bringing things into Chaco Canyon, and it was the site, because of that, the canyon was originally thought of as a redistribution center. But what we actually realize now is there were no products going out. Everything was coming in, being used, consumed in the canyon without anything physical going out. So nowadays it's really considered primarily a religious or ritual pilgrimage site. People would have come to attend regional ceremonies, and that's what they were getting out of providing resources to the people who did reside and maintain the sites and run the ceremonies. The actual materials themselves that were used to build the great houses had to come from some impressive distances. So the sandstone and the timber were actually hauled over 50 to 60 miles to bring them into the canyon itself for construction. It's a huge effort, huge communal project. But also, the majority of the pottery was made using non-local materials. So the Chusca Mountains, which you can see in the upper right image here, is where a lot of the timber was coming from, but it's also where a lot of the material that was used to make the pottery comes from. It's over 60 miles just to get your pots that you're going to need for cooking and eating. Something was drawing people and objects into Chaco Canyon. It had huge significance among Puebloan society. Which brings me to the Chaco Phenomenon. So Chaco was a political, economic, and ceremonial center for the Four Corners area. You can see where it's located here within this greater Chaco culture area. There are over 150 great houses that are connected to Chaco by its regional road system. And the area that was influenced by Chaco expanded to encompass about 65,000 square kilometers, which is huge. It was the center itself of extensive trading network across the southwest and into Mexico, as I've already mentioned. And it was also the focus of turquoise ornament manufacture itself. This map gives you a good sense of the outline of the Chaco world. Also several national parks or state parks where you can go and visit some of these sites, take a look at what the ruins still look like today. As I mentioned, so there's tons of turquoise production, ornaments being made within the canyon and consumed within the canyon. We find them in burials there. But there's no sources super close to Chaco Canyon itself. So what you're seeing from some of these areas, the arrows in the map here on the right, are routes through which turquoise sources would have made their way into Chaco Canyon in order to be made into the objects you see on the left. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few of the great houses themselves. The first being Pueblo Bonito. It's what we call a D-shaped great house. It's located in downtown Chaco. It's occupied from the mid-850s into the early 1100s, but there was also some reoccupation in the late 1100s. It is the largest great house. It contains 32 kivas, 3 great kivas, more than 350 ground floor rooms, which totals to 650 when you consider the 4 other stories that are involved. And it had 2 large middens located just to its south. The population of just this great house alone was probably 500 to 1,000 people, but that's if it was actually a residential structure and not, a ceremonial structure with a small population that would have been used primarily for storage. And there were 2 major excavations at the site, mostly in the turn of the century and just into the 1900s. Pueblo Bonito itself is actually connected to Casa Rinconada, which is a great kiva located on the opposite side of the canyon. We're going to take a look at that in a minute. Pueblo Bonito is 4 stories tall along its northern arc of rooms, and it's a single-story structure closer to the central plaza spaces. So these outer rooms would have faced onto the plaza spaces, but any inner rooms would have been used more for storage. They would not have been as easily accessible. You couldn't have seen or heard anything from those locations. So, also, as I mentioned before too, the center line that cuts through the site has been observed to align with what's now true north. So they have this relates to a concept called the Chaco Meridian. You can look into it if you want. There's books and lots of articles written about it. This is the Great Kiva structures within Pueblo Bonito. You can see some of the features that go along with it. There are wall niches all along the outside. The square rectangular structures inside of it are obviously empty. It's believed that they would have had some kind of wooden planks over them where people could have been using them as foot drums to create noise, make songs, music, while events were taking place within them. Also, there are usually 4 large posts that you can that would have supported the roof. So these were still covered structures, which is quite impressive. Here's an image of Pueblo Bonito from above. You can see some of these great kivas, that are much larger, obviously, than regular family-sized kivas, but also the plaza spaces around them. It's on that back side, the curved side, that would have been up to 4 stories tall. Here we get a better sense of that with the artistry construction. And these are the midden structures as well are out in front, as you can see. Okay, one of the cool things we've learned quite recently about Pueblo Bonito are the presence of burial crypts. Well, actually, we've been aware of crypts for a long time, but we've been learning some new things about them most recently. So there are about 200 burials within the Pueblo, but most of them are concentrated within 2 burial crypts, which you can see in the map on the right. Room 33, which is only about 6 feet by 6 feet in area, and it's only accessible through a roof hatch. In that room, there are 14 stacked burials that were placed over a 300-year period. The initial burial was placed in 880 CE, and it was of a 40-year-old male who was killed by a blow to the head. And that burial is actually one of the richest that has been uncovered so far in the Southwest. 80% of the turquoise found in Chaco Canyon comes from that burial. There are tons of exotics and musical instruments also placed within the burial. And most recently, there's been a controversial DNA analysis that was done by the American Museum of Natural History in New York. It's controversial because it's unclear whether or not they actually got tribal approval to conduct the DNA analysis, and so some people are quite upset by that. Regardless, the study was done, it's been published, and we have learned some quite interesting things. So the 14 people buried in room 33 all share mitochondrial DNA. What that means is it's the type of DNA that you could only get from your mother. So all of these people are related through matrilineal descent. So they gain their prestige or power perhaps through their mothers. They've also been able to identify pairs of relationships. So there's a mother and a daughter that they have found, as well as a grandmother and grandson. And what's most significant about this finding is that it's potential evidence of social hierarchy at Pueblo Bonito, or possibly, running this entire Chaco phenomenon. Who knows? All right, Casa Rinconada is a great kiva. It's located just across the canyon from Pueblo Bonito. It's located within a cluster of small house sites on the ridge on the south side of the canyon. It's the largest of 6 great kivas that have been found in the canyon. It has what are called 2 antechambers. You can see it on the upper and the lower part of the image on the right. There are also sets of rooms that are attached to it. Its interior diameter is 63 feet across, so you can make out 3 circular features within the floor, and those actually would have been the bases of the wooden beams that held the roof up. It contains several of the typical Great Kiva features. So we see the firebox in the middle. There's a bench all along the inside wall. It has the 4 large roof supports, 2 masonry vaults, the square features you can see on either side of the fire, and 34 wall niches. There's also, and hopefully you can see it, there's coming in from the north, there's a 39-foot long underground passage that would have come from the room to the north and would have potentially helped ritual specialists emerge. It would have appeared they were actually emerging from the ground into the Great Kiva. Nobody would have seen them beforehand, and they wouldn't have seen them coming in other than just emerging out of the ground, which would have been a very impressive sort of display. Construction of this structure began in the mid 1000s, and its use likely ended in the early 1100s. So the windows of some of the antechambers have a beam of light that enters into the kiva at sunrise on the summer solstice. So this is another one of those astronomical alignments we talked about before. And the site itself was excavated in 1930. This photo gives you a better sense of the scale. You can see the person here. This is the scale of Casa Rinconada. Okay, finally we're going to talk about Pueblo Alto. This was constructed, it was a great house constructed from 1020 CE into the early 1100s. It's actually a single-story D-shaped pueblo. Had about 130 rooms, 18 kivas, but no great kiva. And there's a large midden located to the southeast. You can see it in the upper right photo. There's a little mound that you can make out. There's been some detailed studies about this. They think it's formed through several pilgrimage feasts, so several large feasting events actually formed this structure. Pueblo Alto is one of 2 great houses that are located on top of the mesa north of the canyon. But regardless of that, it's only about 0.6 miles from Pueblo Bonito. But this mesa top location allowed for possible communication with other nearby houses. It also connected into several Chacoan roads to the north. The site itself was excavated in the 1970s. So what you can see in the photo on the left is at the bottom there, you can see the D-shaped pueblo, that's Pueblo Alto. And then the very faint sort of linear features you see running north, those are the Chacoan roads. Those are the roads we were talking about several weeks ago in our textbook. When we look at the map of them, so in the right-hand map here, we're seeing the red dots, which are great houses and where they're located on the landscape. But then there are the blue lines, which are connecting certain great houses back into Chaco Canyon, as well as the feature that's called the Great North Road going up towards Aztec Pueblo, which is considered one of the locations where people, maybe leaders or ritual specialists, would have moved after the decline of Chaco Canyon. This map too is showing you, the alignments of some of the roads. Pueblo Alto is located there in the middle. You can also see Pueblo Bonito back down in the canyon floor just to the south of it. So there are shrine structures associated with these roads, especially at significant locations on the landscape or where they would have crossed each other. So if you remember, the roads themselves don't take the path of least resistance, which is what we would expect if they were used for economic purposes. Instead, they tend to just go where they want to go because they're probably taking them to ritually significant locations on the landscape. This is a nice aerial image where you can see the layout of some of the roads. And finally, you can actually walk still some of the original stairs on the canyon walls. Obviously the ones on the left are pretty eroded, so they don't let tourists do that anymore, but if you visit today, you can still go and climb up onto the mesa where Pueblo Alto is located and it's a fantastic view down into Pueblo Bonito. So what was Chaco? Well, it could have been a highly centralized chiefdom that was controlled by a small but powerful group of chiefs or nobles, and these people would have monopolized the trade and possessed spiritual powers. Sounds very similar to what we saw amongst the Mississippian chiefdoms. We do have evidence of these elaborate burials as the ones I was talking about with the DNA analysis. And those are there from pretty much from the get-go. So early on, we're already seeing these matrilineal descent in prestige or potential power amongst Chacoan societies. Or it could have been an egalitarian enterprise. It's possible that this was just a cooperative mechanism developed by communities that lived in a very harsh and unpredictable environment. So they wanted to be able to come together to share resources, perhaps. Maybe this was a refuge where people could go in tough times where they lived. Kin ties were and continue to be important in Puebloan society. So everyone had complex obligations to fulfill, not only to the community, but to their clan. So these obligations would have made it possible to complete major construction projects and as well to fill these communal storerooms. The Chaco Phenomenon also could have been an adaptive mechanism. So the existence of Chaco Canyon, people being aware of the strange things that happened at Chaco Canyon, or just the massive size of Chaco Canyon and the sites that were located there, those could have been used if a local kin member or kin leader could show they had some sort of association or affiliation with Chaco. It would have helped them to, regulate their control, help them maintain long distance ties. So this would have given them quite a bit of advantage over the people they were trying to lead. But what we do know is that it reached its peak from 1100 to 1130, which is at the same time that there was a prolonged drought in the area, and this contributed to environmental degradation, which likely caused the system to collapse. So at this time, people moved away from the canyon. They moved into more dispersed settlements, but we were still able to maintain alliances and flourish in other areas moving forward. One of those areas was Mesa Verde, back up in the Four Corners area. This is a dense concentration of ancestral Puebloan communities during the P1 and P3 periods. P2 is an area where population declines quite a bit in this area. The national park nowadays contains 5,000 sites, 600 of which are cliff dwellings. The population in this region grew from 2,500 people early on to over 22,000 people at its height. The area is famous for large masonry constructions that are located at the heads of canyons. You can see in the bottom right image how deep cut some of these canyons are in the area. But there's also cliff dwellings in there too. The tower and multi-walled constructions tend to be quite impressive. From an archaeological perspective, though, we view this as a collection of smaller communities based on central sites and their related outliers, rather than being a really fully integrated civic structure like we were seeing within the Chaco system. The cliff dwellings reflect a trend towards aggregation of increasing populations. So people seem to be wanting to move together for protection, possibly the fact that they're located in defensible locations means they were worried about attack. From 1276 to 1299 CE, this is what we call the Great Drought. This very likely contributed to a period of social and environmental instability, and as well as the abandonment of the region. But there are also partially burned villages and evidence of post-mortem trauma, which suggests periodic warfare or potentially cannibalism amongst people in this region. In fact, there's even one case that I'll talk to you about in a second about that was just a site-wide massacre. So within Mesa Verde, this area was actually rediscovered in the late 1800s by ranchers, but the modern Utes were actually occupying the area at the time. The earliest efforts actually focused on the stabilization of several of the pueblos, specifically Spruce Tree House, Cliff Palace, and Sun Temple. You can see the condition when it was found in 1891 of Cliff Palace here in the upper right image. And Jesse Walter Fuchs, who's in the bottom right photo, was very instrumental in helping to stabilize as well as conduct some excavations in the area. And then the Weather Hill Mesa project was conducted in the late 1950s into the 1960s. So the general occupational history of Mesa Verde starts with the P1 period. This is when we have drought late in the period, which made agriculture difficult, and people would have moved south into what was beginning to be Chaco. In the P2 period, we have Chaco is now over. People begin migrating to different areas, including coming back to Mesa Verde. But in P3, the population boomed. It ended up reaching its peak at 1250 CE, but within 25, 50 years, it was already declining, and there was no Puebloan people living here anymore at 1300 CE. So at that time, people were moving back down south into the areas where we now see modern pueblos today. All right, a few of the sites within the Mesa Verde area, the first being Cliff Palace. It's definitely the most famous. It's the largest cliff dwelling in North America. It contains 220 rooms, 23 kivas, and there's also even some very well-preserved wall murals, like you can see in the upper right image here. It had a population of about 100 to 125 people, but the number of kivas suggests that there were several clans actually occupying this pueblo. So each clan would have had its own living area, but also its own kiva structure for conducting ceremonies or having meetings. Dendrochronology indicates that the construction and maintenance of this structure of this pueblo was from 1190 to 1260 CE, but the majority of the construction actually took place within 20 years. So the square tower, which is in the bottom image on the far right, you can see there's a tower that basically reaches to the top of the alcove. That's been reconstructed though, but it was originally 4 stories or 26 feet tall. Oh, sorry. You can see a few more images here of Cliff Palace, what it looks like today when you go and visit, but also, some artist reconstruction of what this occupation would have looked like. Balcony House is another structure that you could go and visit. It consists of 45 rooms and 2 kivas. It was constructed around 1278 CE, so just before regional abandonment, and was excavated in 1910. You can visit it by traveling up. You have to travel down a 12-foot tunnel and up like a 30-foot ladder to get up there, but I've done it and it's so cool. I really highly recommend it. Another area, so not only were there cliff dwellings, there were also large pueblos up on the mesa top at this time. One of these, this is an image from Chaco Canyon Archaeological Center. They've superimposed the reconstruction of the architecture at Yucca House around the time of 1200 CE. And you can see it located on the landscape where that site still is today. Goodman Pueblo is another large structure where Chaco Canyon has done a lot of work. We can see it has a D-shaped structure, or D-shaped great house that would have dated to Chaco times, but obviously the site grew and was quite large. Here you can see what it looks like within the landscape of today. So Sand Canyon Pueblo, I think, is the last site we're going to talk about today. It's a walled site that's located at the head of a canyon, and it actually has a natural spring that it's built around. The site consists of over 420 rooms, but it has about 90 kivas, 14 towers, and a great kiva. So I think you can see the great kiva here in the bottom right map, the digital reconstruction. You can see the 4 posts kind of sticking out of the ground. The population would have been about 725 people, which is quite large. The site itself was constructed from 1250 to 1280 CE. And there are about 20 multifamily room blocks. So these are clusters of living, storage, work rooms, as well as a kiva. So they would have been an extended family that occupied their own little apartment complex, basically. At 1290 CE, though, the site was abandoned after the massacre of 41 men, women, and children the bodies were just left strewn in the landscape. So we know it was definitely some sort of attack. It was unexpected. People died, and then everyone else just packed up and left. So this is the site map, so you can start to see the concentration of some of these little mini apartments, like I was saying. So areas where clans would have had their kiva or two, and then their living structures around it. But then you also had the Great Kiva, where the community as a whole could have come together for meetings and events. This is another one of those reconstructions. It shows you, where it's located at the canyon head. You have the little spring with the water coming down through the middle. So they were pretty well set up, but still suffered quite a significant attack. So the question remains, why was Mesa Verde abandoned? Well, it's likely a combination of factors. The climate conditions were degrading, so there was drought, but there were also cold periods that would have made it very difficult to continue growing maize agriculture. There was environmental stress, soil was being depleted, they were overhunting their wild game resources, and population pressure and territoriality would have made mobility difficult. So these are people, like I said, that are known for, if things aren't going well socially or if the conditions are degrading, then they just tend to move. But once you're set and these huge settlements have kind of found their space, you can't move just as easily as you would have before. So you have to make an even bigger move out of the area. Also, could have been factionalism or political turmoil that would have contributed to the violence and warfare that we see evidence of as well. Yeah. And this is a little link. Like I said, Chaco Canyon did I drew a lot on their research for the production of this PowerPoint, so I would recommend going and checking out their website for videos and stuff. So at 1250 CE, we see the concentration of Puebloan societies in the Four Corners area and extending over towards Nevada. The period of 1275 to 1299, this is that great drought / great migration. So this is the complete abandonment of the Four Corners area. People are moving south towards the Hohokam, or they're moving east towards the Rio Grande. Around the time of 1300 CE, this is where we're seeing the concentration of Puebloan settlements. And it didn't change much. Between 1300 and 1600, people are still in the same spaces. They're just becoming even more restricted in their territorial control. So this is what brings us to the modern Pueblos. You can see where they're located here in the map versus, where a lot of them would have originally resided in the Mesa Verde area. There's pretty much only the Hopi villages in Arizona. Everyone else is in northwestern New Mexico. In these Pueblos, kivas are still used for clan activities, but they can hold up to 100 to 200 people. They have plazas where people gather for ceremonies and other important events, and tourists are welcome to come visit the site, attend events, obviously buy some of the pottery or other artistic products that these people still make today. Here we can see the Hopi mesas in Arizona. It's 3 major mesas coming off of the landscape. Orabi was actually founded in 1100 CE, so the people have been here for quite a long time. Whilst Walpi is located here on First Mesa. We're going to take a look. This is a historic photo of what Walpi would have looked like in 1920. But people are still there today. Here's an image of Walpi Pueblo today. And this is some of the yellowware pottery that I mentioned to you before that the Hopi are really famous for. Zuni Pueblo, again, another historic photo showing us what it would have looked like. And you can still go today. This is a large plaza space where they'd have dances and other ceremonies. The mesa you can see in the bottom left is a ritually significant spot in the landscape for them. And again, they do still produce, these are still, ceramic producing communities. Taos Pueblo in northern New Mexico, same sort of thing. It's beautiful. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site nowadays. It's absolutely fantastic. They're really well known for this micaceous pottery. So not as, they're not painted as you would see in some of the other communities, but still very distinctive. Finally, Acoma Pueblo, dating from the historic times, and now you can go and visit. They also refer to it as Sky City. It's located on top of a mesa with very steep sides all around it, so it's pretty impressive. And they also produce their own pottery. So these are what we call descendant communities, and with that, it means we have access to what anthropologists call the direct historical approach. So we know modern Puebloans are the direct descendants of ancestral Puebloans. We know it from their oral traditions. The Hopi especially talk about their migrations across the landscape and different places where their ancestors lived and traveled before they settled and found, their home on the Hopi mesas. But also the archaeology. The archaeology tells us the same story. We're able to confirm a lot of their stories. Not all of them, but a lot of the origin stories of these groups. So these communities are an important resource of ethnographic information. You learned about ethnoarchaeology last week. This involves observing behaviors and their material remains to better understand how such behaviors can be recognized in the archaeological record. So if we know how Puebloan peoples do certain things nowadays, what system they use for producing pottery, for producing lithics, we can look for those same sorts of material remains or material signatures in the archaeological record to then better understand and interpret the behaviors that we're actually able to observe. Going with this, though, the traditions of these descendant communities and their privacy must be respected. There are several federal laws that exist to protect their rights. For example, NAGPRA, which we're going to talk about near the end of the semester. And permissions must be granted before research can take place. This is regarding any sort of material culture, things that have been, legally attained. You still need to go to any descendant communities and ask their permission before conducting any type of research. This is why I mentioned the DNA analysis, because the people conducting that allegedly did not go through the proper chain of command to get their permissions squared away. So, all right, that's it for Puebloan and Mogollon societies.